The piercing howl shattered the late afternoon silence. Lily Palmer froze mid-step, her heart hammering against her ribs. That sound, it was raw, desperate, the unmistakable cry of an animal in distress. She dropped the basket of feed she had been carrying and sprinted toward the tree line at the edge of her property, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The dense pine forest loomed ahead, casting long shadows across the clearing. Something was wrong. Then she saw it. A massive python, its thick, muscular body coiled around a struggling wolf. The wolf's dark gray fur was matted with dirt, its sharp claws tearing at the ground as it thrashed violently, fighting against the suffocating grip of the serpent. But the snake was relentless, its coils tightening with every passing second. Lily's stomach lurched. It was her. The pregnant wolf she had been watching for weeks, the one she had secretly named Nova. For a split second, Lily was paralyzed. What could she do? A wild wolf and a 15-foot python. This wasn't a stray cat stuck in a fence. This was raw, merciless nature at its most brutal. But then she heard Nova's strangled whimper, her golden eyes wide with terror. Lily's instincts kicked in. Her trembling hands fumbled for her phone, barely managing to press the right number. "Luke, I need you now." "A python, it's killing her." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Where?" "The pines behind my house. I'm on my way." Lily dropped the phone and grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a thick tree branch. Useless. But she had to do something. She took a shaky step forward, then another. The python lifted its head, its unblinking yellow eyes locking onto her. A slow, menacing flicker of its tongue sent a shiver down her spine. It knew she was there, but it didn't care. Nova let out another muffled cry, her body convulsing as the coils tightened. Lily's grip on the branch tightened. Then, from the distance, a sharp, furious bark. Max. The German shepherd's powerful frame burst through the undergrowth, his snarls cutting through the tension like a knife. Behind him, Luke Martinez appeared, his military-trained focus zeroing in on the scene in an instant. Lily exhaled shakily. He was here. But were they already too late? Pine Grove was a town balanced between two worlds. On one side, perfectly manicured lawns stretched beneath neat rows of houses, each one a picture of suburban tranquility. On the other, the wild pine forest loomed, thick with towering trees and winding trails that led deep into untamed wilderness. It was a place where civilization and nature coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. For Lily Palmer, the forest had always felt like home. Her small ranch-style house sat right at the edge of it, a modest but welcoming place with a wraparound porch and a garden she tended with care. While most people saw the wild as something to keep at bay, Lily embraced it. Stray cats, injured birds, even the occasional deer, her yard had become a quiet sanctuary for the creatures that wandered too close to human territory. But none had ever fascinated her quite like the wolf. It had appeared about a month ago, a lone figure moving through the trees, sleek and cautious. At first, Lily had only caught glimpses of it, a shadow slipping between the pines. But as the days passed, the wolf grew bolder, lingering near the edge of her yard, eyes sharp with curiosity. And then she had noticed it, the roundness in its belly, the careful way it moved. It was pregnant. Lily knew better than to approach a wild predator, but she couldn't ignore it either. Instead, she had started leaving small offerings, bowls of fresh water, carefully placed scraps of meat. The wolf never took them while she watched, but by morning, they were always gone. She had named her Nova. Watching Nova had become a quiet part of Lily's routine, a reminder that even in the wild, life carried on. But she wasn't the only one who had noticed the wolf. Across the street, Luke Martinez watched too. Luke Martinez had spent most of his life above the clouds. A former military pilot, he had once lived for the rush of the sky. The feeling of absolute control as he maneuvered through combat zones with precision and focus. But that was a lifetime ago. Now he lived grounded, his world reduced to the walls of a house that felt too empty. It hadn't always been this way. 2 years ago, his son James had been killed in a car accident. The grief had torn Luke apart, left him stranded in a life he no longer recognized. His marriage had crumbled under the weight of it, and when the divorce was final, he had retreated here, to Pine Grove, a place where no one knew him, where he could be alone. His only company was Max, James's German Shepherd. The dog had been a gift for James's 12th birthday, a scrappy ball of energy that had grown into a strong, fiercely loyal companion. Max had been there the day of the accident. He had waited by the door for James to come home, long after everyone else had accepted the truth. Luke understood that feeling. That was why he had stayed away from people. He didn't want small talk, didn't want neighbors stopping by with forced smiles. He just wanted quiet. But the wolf had caught his attention. He had first seen it on one of his late-night walks with Max, a flicker of movement in the trees. Unlike Lily, he hadn't been fascinated, he had been wary. A wild predator this close to town was a problem waiting to happen. He had considered calling animal control, but something had stopped him. Maybe it was the way Lily watched over it. Maybe it was the way the wolf, despite its size and strength, seemed lost. Either way, he had kept his distance. Until now. Until the python. Nova had become part of Lily's daily routine. Every morning before heading to work, she would step onto her porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, and scan the tree line. Some days, the wolf was nowhere to be seen, her presence a fleeting mystery. Other times, Lily would catch a glimpse of those piercing golden eyes watching from the shadows, a silent acknowledgement of their unspoken truce. She never tried to get too close. She knew better than that. But she couldn't help but feel connected to Nova in a way that surprised her. Maybe it was the quiet strength in the way the wolf carried herself, even with the weight of impending motherhood pressing down on her. Maybe it was the fact that, in some strange way, Lily understood what it was like to be alone. One chilly morning, she spotted Nova sitting at the edge of her property, closer than ever before. The wolf's posture was alert but not tense, her ears twitching as she observed Lily with an almost expectant look. Lily smiled softly. "Good morning, girl," she murmured, careful to keep her voice gentle. She set down a plate of fresh meat near the base of the tree line, then stepped back, allowing distance between them. Nova didn't move, watching her with an unreadable expression. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the wolf rose to her feet, padded forward cautiously, and ever so carefully took the offering. Lily exhaled, her heart swelling with something that felt suspiciously like joy. From across the street, Luke watched the interaction with arms crossed over his chest. He had seen enough in his lifetime to know that getting attached to something wild was dangerous. People liked to believe they could tame nature, but nature had a way of reminding them who was really in control. Still, he had to admit, there was something different about the way Lily handled the situation. She wasn't trying to make Nova a pet. She wasn't reckless in her approach. She was simply offering kindness, expecting nothing in return. And somehow, the wolf seemed to sense that. Max, sitting at Luke's side, let out a low whine. His sharp eyes followed Nova's every movement, his body tense, but not aggressive. Luke ran a hand over the dog's head. "Not our problem, buddy," he muttered. But even as he said it, he couldn't quite convince himself. It happened gradually. One day, Luke found himself pausing a little longer at his window, watching Lily and Nova's interactions with reluctant interest. Another day, he noticed that Max had stopped growling whenever he caught Nova's scent in the air. Then, one evening, everything changed. Luke had been working late, poring over flight data on his laptop when Max suddenly sprang to his feet, ears pricked forward. A second later, A low, rumbling growl rumbled from the dog's chest. Luke frowned. He had learned to trust Max's instincts. The dog rarely reacted like this unless something was wrong. Closing his laptop, Luke followed Max to the front door and stepped outside. That's when he saw Lily standing frozen at the edge of her property, her body tense. Nova was in front of her, but something was different. The wolf's posture was stiff, her muscles coiled like a spring about to snap. Her ears were flattened against her head, her tail lowered in an unmistakable sign of distress. Then Luke heard it. A rustling in the underbrush. Something was watching them. Max let out a sharp bark, stepping forward protectively. Luke's entire body went on high alert. He had spent years in combat situations, trained to read danger before it struck. Right now, every instinct in his body screamed that something was wrong. He moved closer to Lily, lowering his voice. "What's going on?" She swallowed hard, keeping her eyes on Nova. "I don't know," she whispered. She was fine a minute ago, but now, she's acting like something's out there. Luke didn't hesitate. "Get inside," he ordered. Lily hesitated for a second too long. Then, from the darkness of the forest, a low, menacing hiss echoed through the trees. The python had arrived. A sickening tension settled over the clearing. The forest, usually alive with the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds, had fallen into an eerie silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Lily's pulse pounded in her ears as she took a slow step backward, her gaze darting between Nova and the shadowed underbrush beyond. The wolf had gone completely still, her golden eyes locked onto something just beyond the tree line, her muscles taut like a bowstring ready to snap. Max's hackles rose, his body rigid with alertness, a deep growl rumbling in his throat. Luke didn't need to see what was hiding in the darkness to know it was dangerous. He could feel it. His training had honed his senses to recognize moments like these, the fraction of a second before something went terribly, irreversibly wrong. He reached for Lily's wrist, his grip firm but not forceful. "We need to move. Now." Lily hesitated. Every instinct told her to run, to get away, but her feet refused to move. Her eyes flicked to Nova. The wolf was still standing her ground, though Luke could see the subtle tremble in her legs, the way her ribs expanded and contracted with shallow, rapid breaths. She was terrified, but she wasn't running. Then, the underbrush shifted. Slowly, agonizingly, something massive began to emerge from the shadows. First came the head, a triangular shape covered in smooth, gleaming scales, its yellow eyes gleaming with an almost unnatural stillness. Then came the body, thick and muscular, sliding over the ground with a slow, deliberate grace. The python was enormous, at least 15 feet long, its dark brown and gold pattern blending perfectly with the dappled light of the forest floor. It moved with the patience of a creature that had never needed to hurry, a predator that knew time was on its side. Lily sucked in a sharp breath. She had seen stories on the news about invasive Burmese pythons in Florida, about how they had been released into the wild by careless owners and had grown into apex predators, devastating the local ecosystem. But she had never imagined she would come face to face with one. And now one was here. In Pine Grove. In her backyard. The python's tongue flickered out, tasting the air, sensing the presence of its prey. Then, with terrifying speed, it lunged. Nova reacted instantly. With a burst of movement, she leaped to the side, narrowly avoiding the snake's strike. But she was slower than she should have been. Her swollen belly weighed her down, made her sluggish. The python sensed her weakness and adjusted, its massive coils undulating as it prepared to strike again. Luke didn't think. He acted. He let go of Lily and moved, placing himself between her and the unfolding nightmare. Max, sensing his owner's shift in stance, lunged forward, barking ferociously. The python hesitated for a fraction of a second, its head tilting toward the new threat. "Max, stay back!" Luke barked, but the German Shepherd was locked in, his instincts driving him forward. Lily's mind raced. She needed a weapon. Something, anything, to break the python's focus, to give Nova a chance. Her eyes darted to the ground, searching for a rock, a branch, anything. Then she saw it. A rusted metal rake, half buried in the dirt near her garden. She dove for it, gripping the wooden handle with both hands. Her heart pounded as she turned back just in time to see the python shift its focus back to Nova. Not again. Lily acted on pure adrenaline, raising the rake high and slamming it down onto the thick, muscular body of the snake. The impact wasn't enough to wound it, but it was enough to startle. The python recoiled, its head whipping around toward her with an almost intelligent deliberation. Luke saw his opening. With lightning reflexes, he grabbed a fallen tree branch and drove it between the snake and Nova, creating a temporary barrier. Max barked wildly, his eyes locked onto the predator, ready to strike if given the command. The python hesitated. It wasn't used to being challenged like this. It was a master of ambush, a silent killer. But now it faced resistance from a wolf, a man, a dog, and a woman who refused to stand by and do nothing. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, slowly, the python began to retreat. It didn't flee in fear, no, that wasn't in its nature. It simply reassessed, realizing this wasn't a battle worth fighting. With one last flick of its tongue, it slithered back into the darkness of the underbrush, disappearing as silently as it had come. For several moments, no one moved. Then, Nova collapsed. Lily rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the wolf, her hands hovering over the animal's trembling form. Nova was breathing hard, her flanks heaving, her entire body shaking from exhaustion and stress. But she was alive. Luke exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Max circled back to his side, still tense but no longer on the verge of attack. Lily swallowed hard, glancing up at Luke. "She's hurt," she whispered. "We have to help her." Luke met her gaze. He should have said no. He should have reminded her that this was a wild animal, that it wasn't their responsibility. But looking at Nova, at the way she lay there, defeated but still fighting to breathe, he saw something familiar. He saw himself. "All right," he said. "Let's get her inside." Luke barely had time to react before Nova let out a strangled whimper, her body convulsing as she tried to push herself up. She was too weak. The stress of the attack, the weight of her pregnancy, it was all taking its toll. Lily knelt beside her, hands hovering helplessly, her breath coming in short gasps. Luke's mind raced. They needed to get Nova inside before that snake realized it had let go of an easy meal. He looked around, eyes scanning for the fastest solution. Then he saw his truck, parked just a few yards away. If they could get Nova into the back, they could drive her to safety. But how? The wolf was nearly twice the size of Max, and though she wasn't fighting them, her body was dead weight from exhaustion. They didn't have time to waste. A sharp rustling from the underbrush made the decision for them. The python was back. It moved with terrifying patience, its sinuous body gliding over the forest floor, its unblinking yellow eyes locked onto its prey once more. Luke didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest heavy object, a fallen branch, and swung hard, striking the snake's thick body with all his strength. The impact barely fazed it. The predator wasn't interested in him. It wanted Nova. And this time, it wasn't going to back down. Max snarled, leaping forward, his bared teeth flashing in the dim light. Luke barely managed to grab his collar before he lunged. "No," he growled. "Not yet." Max whined in protest but obeyed, his body trembling with restrained aggression. Luke turned to Lily. "We have to move her. Now." Lily nodded, pushing past her fear. Together, they each took hold of Nova, Luke lifting her front half while Lily struggled to support her hind legs. The wolf whimpered but didn't resist, her strength nearly gone. Step by agonizing step, they moved toward the truck, every muscle in Luke's body screaming from the effort. Then, just as they reached the tailgate, the python struck. It moved faster than should have been possible, its powerful coils snapping forward with deadly precision. Luke barely had time to twist his body, shielding Lily as the snake lunged past them, missing by mere inches. It recoiled instantly, its massive head weaving through the air, searching for another opening. Nova whimpered weakly, her golden eyes fluttering open, just long enough to register the danger. She tried to rise, but her legs collapsed beneath her. She couldn't fight. Not this time. Max did. With a vicious snarl, the German shepherd launched himself at the snake, his powerful jaws clamping down on its thick, muscular body. The python let out an eerie, guttural hiss, its coils twisting violently as it tried to shake the dog off. Luke's heart pounded as he saw Max's teeth sink deep into the snake's scales, refusing to let go. But Max was strong, not invincible. The python was already shifting, its body winding like a living rope, preparing to constrict. Luke had seconds to act. He grabbed the tire iron from the back of his truck, his fingers tightening around the cold metal. No time to hesitate. No time to think. He swung with everything he had, the iron bar slamming into the snake's head with a sickening crack. The python recoiled, stunned but not defeated. Another strike. Then another. It writhed violently, its powerful body thrashing against the dirt, but Luke didn't stop. He couldn't. One final blow landed squarely on the base of its skull, and at last, the monster went still. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, Max released his grip, stepping back with a heavy pant, his fur bristling, his eyes still locked onto the fallen predator. Lily gasped, dropping to her knees beside Nova, running her hands over the wolf's trembling body. "She's alive," she whispered. Relief flooded her voice. "But we need to get her inside. Now." Luke didn't argue. Without another word, he lifted Nova into the truck, Max leaping in beside her. Lily climbed into the passenger seat, her hands still shaking. Luke started the engine, his jaw clenched as he tore away from the clearing. They had won. But the fight wasn't over yet. The truck rumbled down the darkened road, its tires kicking up dust as Luke pressed the accelerator harder than necessary. Every few seconds, he glanced at the rearview mirror, his sharp eyes locked on Nova's trembling form in the truck bed. Max lay beside her, his ears flicking back with every unsteady breath she took. Lily sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands clenched into fists against her lap, her mind racing through every possible outcome. The wolf was alive, but for how long? Adrenaline still surged through her veins, her pulse drumming loudly in her ears. She had no medical training for animals, only humans, and right now, she felt helpless. Luke seemed to sense her thoughts. "We'll get her through this," he said firmly, his voice a steady contrast to the chaos still buzzing in her mind. "I know someone." Lily turned to him, her brows furrowed. "Who?" "Maria Rodriguez," Luke replied without taking his eyes off the road. "She's a wildlife vet. I trained with her brother in the Air Force. She owes me a favor." He reached for his phone, dialing quickly. Within seconds, a voice crackled through the speakers. "Luke? Maria, I need your help. It's urgent." A pause. "What kind of urgent?" "Pregnant wolf. Badly shaken, maybe internal injuries. We fought off a python." Another pause. "Jesus. Bring her in. I'll be ready." By the time they reached Maria's clinic, Lily had chewed her bottom lip raw from nerves. The building was small, tucked away at the outskirts of town, but the lights inside were bright, and the doors were already open. Maria stood waiting, A tall woman with sharp eyes and the air of someone who had seen more than her fair share of wild emergencies. "Inside now," she ordered, already moving toward the truck bed. Luke and Lily didn't hesitate, working together to lift Nova's limp body and carry her inside. Max followed, his eyes never leaving the wolf. Maria led them to a sterile exam room lined with medical supplies, where she immediately began assessing Nova's condition. Lily hovered anxiously while Luke stood back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Minutes stretched into eternity as Maria worked, her skilled hands moving swiftly over Nova's fur, checking for fractures, listening to her heartbeat, monitoring her breathing. Then finally she exhaled. She's stable. Weak but no broken bones. The stress nearly sent her into labor, but she's holding on. Relief crashed over Lily so suddenly that her knees almost buckled. She felt Luke's steadying hand on her shoulder before she even realized she had started shaking. "She's gonna make it," Maria confirmed, giving them both a knowing look. But she's not out of the woods yet. The following hours passed in a blur. Maria set up a quiet, climate-controlled space in the back of the clinic, lining it with blankets and dimming the lights to create a safe environment for Nova to rest. Lily refused to leave her side, sitting cross-legged near the wolf's temporary enclosure, watching every slow rise and fall of her chest. Luke, true to form, remained standing, arms crossed, eyes unreadable as he leaned against the doorway. "You should rest," he muttered after what felt like hours. "She's not going anywhere tonight." Lily shook her head. "I can't." Luke didn't push, but he didn't leave either. Instead, he sat down beside her, the weight of his presence grounding her in ways she didn't fully understand. They stayed like that, side by side, as the night stretched on, neither speaking, neither moving, both tethered to the fragile life resting just a few feet away. By morning, Nova stirred. It wasn't much, just a slight twitch of her ears, a small flicker of her golden eyes, but it was enough. Maria checked her vitals again, nodding in approval. "She's strong. She make it." Relief flooded Lily's system, washing away the last remnants of fear. She turned to Luke, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she allowed herself to smile. He held her gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. "Good." But just as quickly, his expression shifted, his sharp gaze flicking to Nova once more. "What happens next?" Maria sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "She can't stay here forever. She needs to be somewhere safe, somewhere she can heal without stress." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Luke spoke. "She'll come with me." Lily's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide. "What?" "I have space," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. "My garage is insulated, quiet. I can set up a safe enclosure until she's strong enough to be on her own again." Maria raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? This isn't a pet, Luke." He met her gaze evenly. "I know." Lily's heart pounded. She hadn't expected this. Luke had been distant, reluctant, wary of getting involved. And yet, here he was, offering his home, his time, his protection. Something in his eyes told her this was about more than Nova. Maria studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right. But you follow my instructions to the letter. Done." Lily exhaled, glancing at Nova. The wolf had fought so hard to survive, had trusted them in ways she never should have. And now they were fighting for her. She looked back at Luke. Maybe he wasn't just fighting for the wolf. Maybe he was fighting for himself too. The days turned into weeks. Nova recovered faster than any of them expected. At first, she barely moved, her golden eyes watchful but exhausted. But as the days passed, her strength returned. She began eating more, standing longer, even pacing the edges of the enclosure Luke had built in his garage. She was still wary, still wild, but she was alive. And for now, that was enough. Lily came by every morning and every evening, checking on Nova before and after her hospital shifts. Sometimes she would sit outside the enclosure and talk about her day, about the patients she cared for, about the things she never told anyone. And though Nova never responded, there was something comforting about the quiet presence of the wolf. Luke, as always, kept his distance. But he was always there, silently fixing parts of the enclosure, making sure the temperature was just right, ensuring Nova had everything she needed. It wasn't spoken, but Lily saw it in the way he moved, the way he watched the wolf from the corner of his eye. And then, one crisp morning, it happened. Nova gave birth. 5 tiny pups, their fur still damp, nestled close against her side. They were small, fragile, but full of life. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she watched through the camera Maria had set up for them. Luke stood behind her, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "She did it," Lily whispered, smiling. Luke nodded. "Yeah." For the first time in years, there was something new in his voice. Something lighter. They cared for Nova and her pups as best they could, knowing their time together was temporary. The day would come when Nova would have to return to the wild, to raise her young where they truly belonged. And when that day arrived, they would have to let her go. And so one quiet morning, they did. Luke drove them deep into the protected wildlife preserve, a place far from people, far from danger. They released Nova first, watching as she stepped forward, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. Then, one by one, the pups followed, tumbling into the grass, their tiny bodies full of untamed energy. Nova turned once, her golden eyes locking onto them. Lily held her breath. Then, with a final flick of her tail, the wolf disappeared into the trees, her pups bounding after her. Silence stretched between them as they watched the last traces of Nova fade into the wild. Then slowly Luke exhaled. "She'd be okay," he said. Lily nodded. "Yeah. So will we." Luke glanced at her, something unspoken passing between them. Then, quietly, he reached for her hand. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone.